Okay, I think it's time to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ESM Prep's webinar for high fives for success on these AP tests. We are just under a month away from all these AP tests starting. So we figured we'd do this webinar to help you and your students get studied and really make sure they are fully prepared to achieve their fullest potential in these exams. So I'll be your main host, Brian Smith, and I'll be also co-hosting with Keely and Kevin. So we'll all be going over talking about our different specialties on the different types of exams for humanities, science, math. We're going to be talking about all the different exams and how to kind of best efficiently maximize your prep over this last month or so heading into these tests. So first, before we get into that, we're just going to talk about some generalities. What are the importance of these tests? Why are we taking these exams in the first place? To really make sure that we want to get the best high scores, we want to know, well, why exactly are we doing this? What is our goal here? Like, what are the stakes? Why do we care about getting high scores on these AP tests and just taking AP exam classes to begin with, right? So let's start with kind of the most obvious one. One of the main reasons for taking an AP test is just getting exposure to college curriculum, getting used to the rigor of a college class and just getting an early idea of what it kind of feels like to take something at a college curriculum level. Like most AP classes are a pretty big step up from regular classes, and most students aren't really used to that and kind of in the beginning. So this is one of the first big reasons why we kind of recommend taking these classes and just getting used to kind of that basic college curriculum stuff. So beyond that, these can lead to kind of just more general soft skills as well, right? AP exams will really force students to really learn how to study effectively and prepare well, right? As many students know, you can't get a 5 just from straight reading through the textbook. Well, I guess you can, but that's not ultimately the optimal way, right, to do that. We generally want to be a little bit more efficient, and then we'll prepare it, and then a little more prepared in our plan for studying, right? So in addition to just kind of learning general curriculum, we can also build these soft skills about how to study effectively for any classes in general. And then, of course, which is mostly we're going to focus on today, learn how to effectively take standardized tests, right? That's a big part of the AP exams. And for a lot of students, it's the first big, especially if they do these as a sophomore or even freshman, the first kind of big standardized test they take. And that's kind of a big part of doing this as well. Okay. So then finally, college admissions. They do have an impact on college admissions as well. They can, although it varies. For the most part, most schools don't place a huge value on AP scores in terms for admitting to schools, but they can matter in certain instances. But that's not generally the main priority unless you are applying for schools in the UK. It's a whole kind of different story there. They do place a pretty high value on the AP tests there. So then finally, though, one of the most important things is that achieving high scores on these AP tests, which is usually defined as a 4 or a 5, colleges will give credits for scores in that way for those scores. For example, when I went to school, I took a bunch of AP tests and I immediately had a ton of AP credits heading into school. So I started my freshman year as technically as almost a sophomore, actually, because I'd attained enough credit from just these AP credits that I'd already gotten a bunch of college credit for it. So I had effectively already taken a bunch of classes and I was able to sign up for some sophomore classes in my freshman year, right? Kind of the next benefit. Keely, Kevin, anything for you guys to add here? Cover everything?
Not a lot. I had a similar experience. I took a lot of APs and I started college as a technically a few credits shy of a sophomore.
Same.
Nice.
Yeah, that was the major benefit that I saw aside from the curriculum exposure, like you talked about, and the test prep skills, because those are critical and they carry you throughout not just your education experience, but into the working world, because testing is a part of our culture. Every job has testing in some way, in shape or form.
Yeah, definitely. And even for me, kind of an underrated aspect of it is that because I kind of started as a sophomore, I was able to get priority registration ahead of a lot of other freshmen, which since I went to a big school, UC Davis, that was actually a pretty big deal. It made it a lot easier to kind of get into some of these high demand classes. So not your primary motivation for sure, but something that I think is a bit on the underrated side.
Graduated early.
Yeah, I mean, and some of the things you can get out of our classes that can be a real pain in the butt your freshman year. Like the AP composition class, you can often get out of freshman comp, which is often a class that everyone kind of hates, and you can take like a fun writing class instead, or maybe you get out of that requirement entirely depending on the school. That's nice. Sometimes you can get out of some of the freshman basics that are less fun.
Yep. Okay, so let's get to the fun parts. So for the first part, we'll talk about all the different AP Humanities exams, which usually includes arts, English, history, and world languages and cultures. Today, I will primarily be focusing on the history and English ones because those are the major ones students take. But if you or your student have any questions about the other ones, feel free to post them in the chat. And in general, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So for these AP Humanities exams, here are the core skills that these kind of exams are generally designed to test: reading comprehension, vocabulary, conceptual understanding, language skills, basically making sure that the student is fully prepared to handle the English, the reading, the writing, and history rigor of a college curriculum. So in terms of remembering these skills and in terms of preparing for these tests, it's really helpful to kind of keep these kind of core skills in mind, right? To score highly on the test, these are the skills that most students need to be generally proficient in, right? So as it talks about actually preparing for them at this point, and in terms of their preparation, students should be just about finishing reviewing semester 1 content. For pretty much any AP test, that's pretty much always your first step. And like around March or April is to start reviewing semester 1 content, right? It's the stuff that the student learned 3 to 4 months ago. It tends to be the stuff that they forget. And that's kind of like the first big step, is to start reviewing, right? So for AP US history, for example, that would be reviewing all the content basically before the Civil War. And so at this point, the student should have reviewed that already, either in your textbook or review book or whatever resources they have for that. So that's kind of step number 1, right? Then step number 2, generally speaking, is learning the test itself, right? What exactly is the structure of the test? Is it purely multiple choice? Are there essay questions, which is usually the case for humanities? And in particular, that is the thing I want to emphasize with the humanities, is making sure that you understand the essays. And in particular, this is the most underrated aspect, understanding the essay rubrics inside and out, especially for the history exams. For a lot of a common mistake that students make when they start working on the history essays, the DBQs and the LEQs, they start kind of treating them like the English essays, and that they feel like they have to write creative, really well-written, like high vocabulary essays, which is true for the English classes. For literature and lang, that's important. But for history, it's really more about checking boxes, right? It's really more that, like, for a history essay, you just need to have a good thesis. As long as you have a thesis, you get checked, you get a point for that. You need to talk in a DBQ, you need to talk about all the documents. And as long as you do that, you get a point. It doesn't really matter to a certain extent, like how good your analysis or anything like that. So the point is, your first step here is get those rubrics, learn them inside and out, right? It's not a creativity thing. For the most part, when graders are looking at these essays, they're pretty much just checking boxes. They're just seeing, did you do this thing? If so, you get the point, right? So that's kind of the first kind of big thing. Make sure you learn these tests kind of inside and out and be prepared for them, and also kind of learn basic strategies, right? So it's kind of the general ideas. Keely, Kevin, anything to add here? Maybe really too much. I think the humanities stuff for the most part is pretty straightforward, right? Other than like making sure you learn the rubrics, right? Kind of reviewing and preparing and that kind of thing. But again, if you have any more questions or want me to go in more depth in any particular, let me know and we'll get to it at the end. Okay, so now the fun ones, the STEM exams, right? Keely, I'll let you start here.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of these and they've changed quite a bit over the years. So they revamp the curriculum on these roughly once a decade, but sometimes they mess that up and mess that schedule up. They broke the physics 1 into 2 exams, and then it changed how it was broken up. Anyhow, point is, there's multiple physics exams. There's AP Calculus AB and BC. There's AP Chem, there's AP Bio, there's AP Environmental Sciences, which you'll often hear students refer to as APES, APES. And you've also got a Comp Sci class, an AP Stats class, and coming in 2024, so I guess the first year students will be taking the class will be this fall, is the AP Pre-Calculus class. These tests tend to have written portions and multiple choice portions just like the other ones. And a lot of the prep is similar. You want to be in that you want to be by this point having reviewed all of the content from the first half of the year. And be getting into the later stuff and doing practice practice questions. It's generally hard to find officially released multiple choice practice for these tests. There's usually only 1 or 2 years of those available. So third-party resources like prep books tend to be really important for the multiple choice prep. But there are many years for most of these tests of the written questions available, the FRQs. And so that's a lot of what students need to practice with. Similarly to the English and history, you really want to know the rubrics and the structure of the tests well. There are key words that they use on all of the AP Sciences exams that tell you exactly what they're looking for in the question. There's like a list of verbs, explain, describe. They seem like very basic, but there are specific things that they're looking for with each of those, like diagram, etc. And so knowing exactly what is required when each of those verbs are used is really helpful for students being able to efficiently use their time and not fail to provide something that's expected or over answer a portion of a question. A lot of students in a good AP class are going to have seen a lot of FRQs used during the course itself. So some teachers use these as practice homeworks. Some of them use prior year's tests in making their own tests. And so that definitely gives students a leg up. That happens more in classes where we have more practice materials available. A lot of schools also will have students take a full practice test as part of their class, but that shouldn't be taken for granted. Students should be talking to their teachers about what the study plan for the class is. So some of my students in AP Chemistry, for instance, have already pretty much wrapped the course material and are spending the next month of class entirely on review. Some still have a unit and a half to go. And so they'll be finishing new material like 2 weeks before the AP or a week before the AP. So students shouldn't be counting on having a ton of review time in class. They should be expecting to do a lot of prep on their own and a lot of review on their own. If their teacher does build more of that into the year, that's great. But they can't just like take that for granted. And same with like if a teacher has used FRQs and test materials during the class, that does tend to give you a leg up on your studying, but it doesn't get you out of practicing taking full tests. These are very long tests. It's really important to practice the stamina needed for that longer stretch. It's usually longer than a typical even midterm in a high school course. Yeah, I think that's those are the main points. All of these are really valuable classes to take. Some of them definitely hold a little bit more weight with colleges. In math, people like to see calculus. Even though statistics is a great class and will get you college credit, for really competitive schools, they're often looking for those calc classes. And there's some kind of unique classes in the STEM area as well. Comp Sci kind of stands on its own. It's unique class. And AP Environmental Sciences is, yes, a science class, but it incorporates a lot of policy and environmental policy like history. So a lot of students who lean more towards the humanities end up doing that one as their AP Science.
Thank you, Keely. Kevin, you got anything to add?
I was very thorough.
It was. So yeah, that's all kind of the big STEM like classes. Like, these are the big, like kind of chunky classes that are usually for most students the most difficult ones. So they're the ones we really want to make sure. Well, obviously, you want to get high scores on all the tests, but these are the really big ones. Right? Okay, so then last we have these kind of other AP exams. Kevin, you want to handle this one?
Sure. I mean, we all hear about the big ones that are offered at most schools, the bios, the US histories, European histories. They're pretty ubiquitous. But there are many others. They have actually trimmed the fat a lot lately, but there are opportunities for students to gain other skills and show that they're a serious student. So I think a lot, yes, the credit is very beneficial, but some schools may not accept the credit regardless of your score, but they'll see that you're a serious student, that you engage in research, or that you engage in essay writing, that you engage in presentation skills, that you engage in these higher level academic activities that, again, colleges will have you participate in. So it just shows that you're ready and serious. And it can make your transcript kind of stand out in certain ways, depending on what you're applying to. So beyond what your schools just offered, you can always look into the College Board offerings and see what else you can do to kind of not just sort of stand out, but show what you can do, highlight your skills as a student outside of classes.
Okay, great. So on this last kind of big slide, we're just going to recap everything and go a little bit more in detail. We do have some time, so I think we'll be able to go a little bit more in depth on some of these classes in particular, right? So this is kind of the general summary of all these kind of study tips and strategies that we kind of talked about in the last few slides, right? So first, no matter what test we're talking about, we want to familiarize ourselves with the format and expectations of the exam. You know, what actually is the exam testing, right, in terms of content, or reviewing your content and all that stuff, but also knowing the different question types and that kind of thing, right? Preparing for history is different just because it has 4 different question types: multiple choice, short answers, LEQ, and FRQs. Whereas compared to economics, economics is just multiple choice and then very short response questions, right? So just the pure format definitely does make kind of preparing, pretty different, right? And second, make a plan. Like, so this is pretty simple, right? Like we kind of talked about this a little bit, but basically, generally speaking, most plans for most classes will look like this: review semester 1 content, figuring out and first to do so, make sure you find good resources for that. As I mentioned earlier, I don't really recommend rereading through dense textbooks. That's not usually the best way to review. So usually it's a good idea to get some sort of review book or use YouTube videos or Khan Academy, whatever works best for the student or is specifically recommended for the specific class as a resource. For example, for AP US History, I really like the AMSCO, AMSCO book. Does a really good job of like still being fairly comprehensive, but not like as big as an actual test book. So it's a lot more manageable and less intimidating to read through and works great for review, right? And then once that basic process is finished, where we've got through the content down, we've reviewed it, we've learned the kind of the test itself, it's time for a practice test. Like this is about now, the next week or two, where it's time to take a full practice test, if available. They can be pretty difficult to find, right? APUSH, for example, only has 1 official released full practice test, right? Now, some of these review books will have their own second-party practice tests, which obviously won't be as good as the official ones, but they will be better than nothing. So if that's what you have, then you should definitely use that. But based on the practice test, I can give you a better idea of where your student is at, where you need to kind of hone in your prep, what areas you need to focus on reviewing, where you need to learn the test better. Okay, so that's kind of the general stuff. Keely, Kevin, anything to add? Any specifics for certain classes you want to go more in depth on?
I would definitely want to highlight the making a plan part, because there's a lot of self-study that's required to do well in AP exams. What you do in class will never cover the full gamut or the full spectrum of the information or the potential types of questions that you could cover or that you could see on the real thing. So by doing enough practice, frequently, consistently, it doesn't need to be 3-4 hours a day. Don't be crazy. I think it's just being consistent and having a schedule that says, okay, like Brian said, make sure I cover the things that were covered in the first semester, because memory, right? Just time in between topics can really make it harder to recall certain things. So you want to make sure that you review that information. But you also want to make sure that you review the things that you may not have gotten to towards the end of the semester, because it's just not enough time to cover the dense amount of information that these tests can ask you about. So making a plan is going to help you stick to it. Schedule out some time, block it out. We know life gets crazy and you have busy lives. So engaging in time management strategies is going to be critical. that's also what people note, or admissions officers may note, that when students are working hard on AP exams and AP exam prep, they engage in time management skills and strategies. And that can be very beneficial because you learn, again, how to take a lot of information and distill it for yourself so that you can do well on the task. So make a plan for it.
Kevin, thank you, Kevin. Keely, any final thoughts here?
Not really. Yeah, having a plan is important. And we do still have a month. So I love to have students have started before now, especially to have made their full plan before now. But if you're starting now, it's not too late. You still have about a month for most of the APs to get some serious work in. But yeah, I would be taking a practice test in the next 2 weeks to make sure you have at least one practice test for before you and like you can use that to assess where you need to study more.
Yeah, and for the practice test, try to take it in as test conditions as possible. It's pretty difficult to simulate, especially with an AP test when it's at your school in a formal environment. But all I mean by that is just make sure you take it all at once. Do the multiple choice first, if that's what's multiple choice is usually first. Do the essays right after the multiple choice with the scheduled breaks kind of built in. That is an important part of it. If you do them separately, it may not be as accurate as that. One final thing with that I will add is that for grading essays and that kind of thing, it might be something you can do yourself, but it's probably a good idea for you to ask someone else to do it. It's like another tutor or a teacher or even another student is probably better than you grading it yourself, right? That's kind of one other last really big tip I would recommend with that. Okay.
One more thing I would want to highlight. If you do get testing accommodations, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to sign up with the College Board separately. Most schools may or may not support you through that process if they know about it. I used to work at the learning support counselor at multiple schools, and that was something that if you use them, ask for them, especially if
that actually reminds me of one other small thing too. Some tests may be digital, right? It is most tests these days are paper tests, but it is technically up to schools. They do have the option of offering a digital exam. So make sure that you should know by now. Make sure you know already, because the tests aren't fundamentally different, but it is a different experience taking on digital versus paper. So just something to keep in mind, right? Just make sure you know which one you're taking. Yeah. Okay, so for the last part, we'll just answer any questions you guys have. So feel free to post them in the chat. We already have a couple. I think I will start with Ellie has already asked us a couple of questions. I think we'll start with the second one. Keely, this one I think is for you. Ellie asks, what is the best way to prep for the AP bio test, especially if we aren't finishing our new material until 2 weeks before the test?
So if you're not finishing new material until 2 weeks before the test, that's when you're going to really want to start prepping on your own now, because you're not going to have time to review everything in the 2 weeks between when you finish new material and the test. So I would make your goal to finish all of your first semester prep review about a week before you're finishing new material in the class. I know that's a lot to do, but AP Bio really builds on itself. So a lot of this stuff should probably still be fresh. A lot of the details of the early stuff is what tends to get students. So teachers do units in somewhat different order sometimes, but depending how long ago you had it, like cellular respiration and photosynthesis, remembering the details of all of those things, it's probably not fresh, although you probably know the big picture very well. Looking back at other very detail heavy things that you maybe didn't, that you maybe need to refresh on. You can use how you did in the class as a guide to some of this. You're probably going to need more time to study something that you didn't do as well on. If you've done awesome all year, then great. You're still going to want to look back at harder material or more detailed material. It is useful when you're doing this to use to look at the actual course description for AP Biology. It's on College Board's website. It's a huge PDF that goes through every unit and this is available for every AP class. and every standard within those units. Sometimes your teacher might have required you to memorize more than is actually required for the AP, or they didn't cover something that is required on the AP. If your teacher's taught AP Bio for a long time, they're usually lined it up pretty closely, but there's a few people who are old school and want to like make you memorize stuff that isn't required on the current test anymore. I ran into a student this year whose teacher made him memorize all of the enzyme names and steps of the Krebs cycle. That is not required on the test. So you don't want to be wasting your time on that. You, for like things that are very memorization heavy, be looking at those standards and making sure you're getting the information that's required, but not going overboard. Yeah, that would be my big picture stuff. In terms of materials to use, Bozeman Science on YouTube is very good for review videos. The 5 steps to a 5 books are good for prep books, and albert.io is good like online materials. They have paid stuff, but they also have like a big free guide that links out to open source online textbooks for detailed things. So that can be a good quick reference for what's on the test. And they do update it every year, so it's pretty accurate to the current test.
Okay, thank you.
If there's any more questions, feel free to shoot them at me.
Okay, so our second question is a bit thornier, I would say. And she asks, how much do AP scores matter for admissions to private schools versus public schools? And so to first kind of initially answer that, I would kind of reframe the question a little bit. It's not really private versus public schools. It's more highly selective versus not highly selective schools is more the question you should be asking, because I don't think it's too big of a difference in private versus public. And this question in general is pretty complicated because the answer, broadly speaking, is that it depends. But I would say they do matter a little bit more at highly selective schools. But broadly speaking, the first thing I want to emphasize is that AP scores definitely do not make a huge impact in terms of admissions. There's a pretty simple reason for that, because it wouldn't be fair to, there are many schools who do not have access to the AP test at all. So like students aren't even able to take AP tests at a lot of different high schools. So it's not fair for AP scores to be considered a major part of admissions when a lot of students don't even have access to them in the first place. So first, I just really want to emphasize that. That doesn't mean they play no part, but it's a fairly minor part relative to grades, SAT, scores, extracurriculars, right? It's way, way down the list on that one, right? Now, highly selective schools, they can matter a bit, right? That if you really want to demonstrate your subject mastery in a specific class, like especially if you want to major in biology, for instance, then you probably should submit a 4, at least a 4, preferably a 5 on the AP test, because you can demonstrate that you got the high grade and you also got a high score in a standardized test. But it's really always, even in that case, it's really more of a value add to your application rather than like a core determinant. It's not going to get you into the school. It's not going to get you out either, but it can help in certain areas, right? That's kind of the main way I would answer that question. Keely, Kevin, am I missing anything there?
No, you hit the nail on the head, especially when you talk about like majors. These things aren't as impactful as some people might assume because it's a whole package, whole big picture type of situation. And it does show that you are a serious student, if nothing else, and it can set you apart again if you're compared to everybody else who has similar credentials.
A lot of people thought that once SC and AC went more test optional, and especially like the UCs went completely test blind, a lot of people theorized that the AP scores would become higher priority. And like, who knows, maybe that would still, in terms of admissions, maybe that will still happen. But I don't think it's going to make a big case until these AP tests become more widely available, which I just don't see happening in the immediate future. So I think this is going to continue to be the case where they exist, they're there, they can be a value add, but they're not going to be a major determinant, right? The main reason why you should try to get a high score on these is for credit. That really is the biggest reason to get a high score on the test, right?
I think they're a good way to show academic strength, particularly and they can be supporting if you do have some less perfect grades, right? If you're getting 5s on the APs, then especially in like your strongest areas, that's that's a way to show some strength. But yeah, it's a value add to your application. It's not, it doesn't make up entirely for weak areas elsewhere, and it's not the end all. But yeah, the credit is really meaningful when you get to school.
Yeah, and then
I want to add, on top of the credit, there's usually a GPA boost to a certain extent, because these classes are so challenging, and you're not going to score so high early on that they make adjustments for your high school GPA. And while you do have to submit your unweighted GPA as well as your weighted, it can have at least bolster your application in that way.
And just to kind of explain your initial question, the private versus public schools part, private schools versus public schools generally don't have that difference in terms of like how they admit students. Like that definitely can vary. That's not kind of a general rule, but again, really what you want to be thinking is comparing highly selective versus low versus like lesser selective schools. That's really more what you want to be thinking than private versus public in terms of like, do they do anything different in terms of admitting students? Okay, that was our last question. We'll give it, a little bit more, but I think that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Keely. Thank you, Kevin. If you guys have any last minute questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, that will pretty much wrap everything up. The recording will be available soon, and you should get you get an email with the recording, a full recording of the webinar that you can access at any time. And if you have any questions in the future, please reach out. Feel free to reach out to ESM any moment. We'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about anything.